Have you ever been picked on by a bully? Well, luckily I dodged being picked on for the most part through school, but I had some friends who were just tormented by bullies. One that comes to mind was in middle school. A young man that I knew liked to read. He would read these fat fantasy books before class, before the bell would ring. And because of that, simply because of that, he got picked on. And there was one guy in particular who, in some contexts, was actually a nice guy, but in this context was a bully to my friend. He would just pick on him mercilessly. And so at some point, my friend realized that he had to stand up for himself. It was very calculated and methodical for him. He realized that if I don't do something about this now, it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and I'm going to deal with it for the rest of my life. And so he decided to make a stand. And so in science class in 8th grade, he picked up a stool and he bopped that guy on the top of the head. Now, he didn't hit him with all his force. He wasn't trying to kill him or, mortally wound him or anything. He was really just trying to send a message. And so he bopped the guy on the head. The guy bled down his face, but he never picked on him again. And in fact, years later, that guy who had picked on him came back around and said, "Hey, I'm sorry, man. I was out of line. That was uncalled for, the way that I treated you." And they became not like good friends or anything, but they became at least amicable. And so, we love a bully story that ends a certain way. Another one that I think of is Back to the Future. There's a classic bully in Back to the Future, and his name is Biff. And I think one of the reasons that Back to the Future is so great is that B story with Biff, where Biff gets punched out by McFly. If you've never seen Back to the Future, it's a lot of fun. Well, we're reading through the book of Acts, and we're up to chapter 12. We're trying to read a chapter a day. And so we're to chapter 12. So if you haven't read chapter 12, I think you're going to enjoy, at least in some ways, it's a bully story. There's a person who is becoming a problem for the church, and in fact a huge bully, and he gets his in the end. That's a bit of a spoiler alert. So if you haven't read it, go ahead and pause the video. You can find the text of the chapter in this post. So read through that and then play the video. Have a couple of thoughts on it. So if you're still watching, I assume that means you've read the chapter. So this chapter deals with Herod. Now, there were a number of Herods in Israel around this time. This is Herod Agrippa the First. So there was a Herod Antipas and there was a Herod the Great. This is the grandson of Herod the Great and the half-step brother something or other like that to Antipas. And so this guy had a certain amount of power, but not as much as his grandfather did, but still a man in power. And he was a dislikable guy. The chapter opens with it saying that he had James, the brother of John, killed. This is one of the main apostles. It says he was killed with a sword. Generally what that means is he was beheaded. So it was an official execution. So, a lot of times they would execute with an axe, but in this particular time, the sword would be what they used. So, so he had him executed, and he realized that the people liked it, that the Jewish people liked it. Not the believers, of course, but the other Jewish people who were opposed to Christianity, they liked it. And so he decided to do more. Now, is this not exactly how every bully story works? They get a taste for it, and they hear the giggle of their friends when they pick on somebody, and they can't stand but to do it more. They just, they have to do, they have to up the ante, so to speak. And so he captures Peter, and there is a miraculous jailbreak in this chapter. So it talks about how he's locked down with a certain number of guards. Herod actually had his own army. He had his own force. So these were not necessarily Roman soldiers, although they're described in a similar way. The way that it's squadrons of 4, that's a Roman style. So hard to say whether they were actually Roman or if they were Herod's Jewish forces. But one way or another, they're serious and they operate like a Roman regiment. And so one of the things that would happen with Roman soldiers who are to guard a prisoner is that if the prisoner escaped, they would be liable for whatever punishment the prisoner was liable for. So if it was imprisonment, then the guards would be imprisoned. If it was death, they would face death. And so these guards actually did face that when Peter escaped later on. One of the most interesting things I think about this chapter is that the believers are praying. They're together praying for the release of Peter. And so this is probably because James had been captured, James had been executed, and so they knew where this was heading. They knew that Peter was on the chopping block, and so they were praying for them. But because they had, this is an assumption, but because James had been executed, and they probably prayed for him as well, they have a bit of a crisis of faith. They seem to not believe that their prayer is going to do any good, because when Peter actually shows up after his jailbreak, they don't even believe it. And I can totally understand this. Prayer is really hard for me. Prayer, it's easy to feel like nothing's happening, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. I have a hard time praying, honestly. I have a hard time asking for things. I have a hard time believing that prayer is actually going to do something. And so this little section here, I really identify with. I mean, these guys, they're speaking my language. Like, we're praying because we're supposed to, but it's hard to believe that it's actually doing anything. And so Peter comes in, and they rejoice, and he quiets them because they're under persecution here. It's dangerous. The way that the house is described with a servant, and they're in a back room and all this, it sounds like it's probably in the upper part of the city where the more wealthy live, the aristocrats. So possibly in the same neighborhood, because it's a wealthy neighborhood, there could be other members of the Sanhedrin or the aristocracy. And so this is probably why he quiets them down, because they're still kind of in danger. They're still under this persecution. So then the story moves on, and it talks about the death of Herod Agrippa. And so it talks about a couple of political things, that Tyre and Sidon send some emissaries, and Herod gives this great speech. And so what's interesting about this is this actually dates the chapter for us, because Josephus, a Jewish historian, talked about this. He dated it around 44 A.D., and so this happens to be about 11 years after Jesus' resurrection. So some time has passed here. And so Herod, this man who had persecuted the church, he gives this great speech. And those who were there, they praised him. They say, this is like the words of a God, not a man. Now, in Greek and Roman sort of culture, that was normal for them to do to a Greek or a Roman leader. But even the Romans, when that would happen, they would deflect. They would say, oh, you're too kind, or something like that. Herod doesn't do that. He accepts the praise, and I imagine him just sort of standing there like, yeah, you bet I'm a god, And so it says that he basically dies for it, that an angel struck him. And so the interesting thing there is that Josephus, the historian, references this exact event. He says that, sure enough, when he gave this speech, something happened, and he basically fell out. It says that they carried him to his palace that was not very far away, and he died 5 days later. Now that's basically what the chapter says, but it's also what Josephus, the Jewish historian, says, and it says that he was eaten up with stomach worms. Oh, stomach worms. And so, so basically there's a historical corroboration here between Josephus and the Bible, and it's nasty. But it's a bully getting what he deserved. I mean, I hate to say that, because it's really pretty awful that he, eaten up with worms, but it wasn't a terribly uncommon thing for that time, but it was apparently really painful and really awful. And so this great bully of the faith, this man who stood in the way of the church and the believers, and even executed some of the believers, he gets his in the end. And so it's not like a happy ending, sort of like Back to the Future is, where Biff just sort of changes No, this one is a little bit darker, but it's a reminder that God, at least in that time, was very active in the world, in politics. In the book of Daniel, Daniel talks about how, and this is the Old Testament, Daniel talks about how God is in control of rulers, that he would place men and women on the throne, generally men in that time, but he would place men on the throne and he would move them about, and they were his pawns. And this is another example of that. It's hard to believe that, it seems like, in today's culture, but it's definitely what the Bible teaches, that the rulers of men are in the hand of God. And Herod is a great example that, he accepted the praise as if he were a god, and the real God did not like that. And, probably also related to the fact that he was persecuting his children, his believers. So feel free to throw a few thoughts in the comment section. Love to know what you think about Herod and the whole bully story. One thing I didn't mention is that this shows, again, how the church is growing. About a decade had passed. And so give me your thoughts on that. Let's discuss it in the comment section. We haven't had a whole lot of comments in the last couple of posts, so if you have any ideas on how to make the videos better too, I'd love to hear that. I want to apologize. Yesterday I walked around the yard and I got a couple of comments that made people feel a little queasy, so sorry about that. That's why I'm sitting. I had coffee, so I'm talking a lot, but that's why I'm sitting today. So love that. Let me know if there's any way we can make them better. I want this to be valuable to the folks that watch. So feel free to comment and share. And anyways, that's the video for today. Hope you have a great Friday. We're going into the weekend, so tomorrow we'll be looking at chapter 13. So thanks for watching. See you later.